Hello, this is Cyrce, and in this Blood Death Knight analysis video, we will be providing you with information on the state of Blood Death Knight and Blood Death Knight theory crafting for Mythic Plus as of 11.0.7. I've been behind on videos this season, so I will be touching on initial season recommendations, going over the changes Blizzard has made to Blood Death Knights throughout this season, along with their implications, the things we have learned with data that only became available during the season as opposed to before the season, and we will talk about Circe's Circlet, the new ring in 11.0.7. If you are just interested in the new ring, feel free to skip ahead to the appropriate section. In case you were looking for it, I did not make a video for the initial Mythic Plus recommendations for 11.0 or 11.0.5, so you would only have seen them if you checked my written advanced guide on Blood Death Knights, or if you were paying attention to the Blood DK Theorycrafting Discord server. The links to both of those can be found in the video description below. Since I prioritize updates to both of those sources over making videos, and I only make videos if I have time to spare beyond that. To start, let us summarize what has changed with Blood Death Knight over the season. These changes almost entirely had to do with hero class balance, which, at the start of the expansion, was heavily favored in the direction of Deathbringer for just about everything except for AoE damage potential on large packs of enemies. That being said, Blizzard had a hard time going more than 2 weeks without changing the balance between Deathbringer and Sandlane during the season. Originally, 11.0.5 was going to give Deathbringer a slight single target damage buff through a talent rework, as well as a slight survivability nerf with a rune-carved plates change. This adjustment was not going to significantly change its overall power in Mythic Plus. But then, shortly after, Blizzard decided to make Sand Lane revolve around the Dancing Rune Weapon instead of Vampiric Blood. Swapping the hero class over to Dancing Rune Weapon looked like a net nerf at first, since Dancing Rune Weapon has a lower uptime than Vampiric Blood, and most of Sandlane's value was tied in the designated cooldown window. That said, Blizzard was quick to provide several damage buffs to Sandlane in the 2 weeks leading up to patch 11.0.5, before the Dancing Rune Weapon change went live. These changes made Sandlane competitive for single target damage and raid settings, but Sandlane's overall benefits still seem to be falling short in Mythic Plus compared to Deathbringer, whose survivability advantage still overshadowed any potential damage benefit of Sandlane. This situation didn't last long, however, since Deathbringer would eat another nerf to several of its core abilities when patch 11.0.5 launched, and a week later, Blizzard would compensate Blood Death Knights with buffs to most of their core abilities, as well as several additional buffs to Sand Lane, which started to generate signs that Sand Lane might finally be more effective than in Mythic Plus than Deathbringer, by some amount with its higher damage potential, even if it had worse survivability. Blizzard would then decide that they were overly harsh on their Deathbringer nerfs from 11.0.5 launch, and they would revert the nerfs to Deathbringer, which has seemingly brought the hero classes to a mostly balanced state in Mythic Plus content overall. If not for their differences in secondary stat priorities, it might even be a decision you would change from dungeon to dungeon. As for the theory crafting side of things, at the start of a new expansion, we are mostly relying on mitigation models and simulation craft to estimate how effective different options are based on the mitigation, damage, and effective health differences they provide. Historical data from Dragonflight is also used as appropriate to compare which options should be more or less effective for Mythic Plus success. Now that we are far enough into the new season, we have enough player logs from this current season to do regression analysis on these logs, where we can look at all logged runs by Blood Death Knights this season and see how, on average, different build options performed relative to each other with regards to overall dungeon success rates and other metrics. While not as directly useful, we also have seen how player trends have played out for most of the season with regards to what options players are using. So, in addition to the balance changes Blood Death Knights has received, a lot of this video will be touching on things we know now that we did not know originally at the season start. In my previous video on the Deathstrike nerfs, there were several aspects of them that we did not know how they would play out with 100% certainty. But now we have answers to a lot of those questions. First, since we can no longer heal from the same damage instances twice from Deathstrike, there was some uncertainty as to how much Deathstrike mitigation would scale off of haste. On one hand, we can only heal from damage taken in the last 5 seconds, so there are plenty of situations where being able to Deathstrike more than once every 5 seconds would have no defensive value. But on the other hand, if we are taking sufficiently high enough damage for long enough that we need to use Deathstrike at a faster rate to survive the incoming burst damage, maybe it could still allow for some amount of effective haste scaling. Upon further investigation, the existing log data from 11.0.5 indicates that whatever amount of haste scaling Deathstrike mitigation has is now only a fraction of what it previously was in Dragonflight, and from current indications, you would be safe to assume that it is approximately zero outside of indirect benefits being provided by Red Thirst. The second concern with the Deathstrike changes was a concern that players would be able to generate a blood shield larger than the cap off of a single Deathstrike, which could have potentially soft capped the defensive value of mastery in certain situations. Now that we actually have high key logs to look at from Blood Death Knights this season, we could use programming scripts to calculate how much blood shield capping actually occurs in keys. At least for now, the amount of blood shield waste we see is approximately zero, even from Blood Death Knights who prioritize mastery above all other secondary stats, and even while Vampiric Blood is active in the highest keys where they're taking the most damage. The main reason we don't see this happening is because of the first Deathstrike nerf that stops us from being able to heal from the same damage instances twice, which got rid of the potential for us to have supersized Deathstrike heals from persistently high incoming damage. As we gain more secondary stats in future seasons, this could potentially still be a source of waste that actually occurs, but at least at current secondary stat levels, it is not an issue at all and does not affect decision making in any way. So, with those Deathstrike specifics out of the way, let us start going into some build details with the Death Knight class talent tree. This is an image of my original recommendations for the class tree talents, where all circled talents are optional flex talents. While I am only advocating that players take one of the talents between suppression and blood scent, since they are both weak. Moving into this expansion from Dragonflight, the main thing to keep in mind is that we gained a much greater ability to get all of the talents we want from this tree. So, the last talent point we spend in the tree is now going to be on a weaker talent than what we were willing to pick up in Dragonflight. And in addition to that, Soul Reaper was now heavily discounted from what you had to give up to get it in Dragonflight since they moved it from being a capstone talent into the middle of the tree instead. As a result of this, the initial talent recommendations were a lot more open-minded to taking weaker talents that would never be used in competitive Dragonflight builds, like Wraithwalk and March of Darkness, while Soul Reaper was originally thought to be much more competitive than any of the lower powered talents it was competing with. Once we had sufficient log data to start comparing the effectiveness of these utility talents, it quickly became obvious that Wraithwalk, March of Darkness, and Vestigial Shell did not have any general use cases in Mythic Plus. And if not for the fact that some dungeons don't fully benefit from all of the utility options, and in those situations, you have nowhere else to productively put those talent points, Blood Draw would have joined this list as well. For now, I can just say that Blood Draw is likely overused in its current state, but not that it doesn't have situations where it is appropriate to take. Something that surprised me is that Soul Reaper was not always associated with positive outcomes in dungeons. Despite how strong Soul Reaper is compared to other talents you would otherwise take in the talent tree, only the population of players pushing above the plus 10 key level seem to be positively impacted by the talent on average. To me, this indicates that some players use Soul Reaper better than others, and if you are not using it well or at all, it might not be worth taking over an alternative talent. For this reason, I have backed off my original stance of pushing for everyone to always take this talent, and I think it is worth respecting that unless the player has a certain level of proficiency with the Blood Death Knight rotation, it might not be worth using Soul Reaper in Mythic Plus for that population of players. Granted, it should still be the goal to eventually use Soul Reaper, it just might not be an appropriate starting point for people. Just for a quick refresher, you only want to use Soul Reaper when there is an obvious single priority target, and otherwise the benefits do not outweigh the costs of using it. This is especially true of Reaper of Souls procs for Deathbringer, since not only do these procs occur at the start of pulls a lot of times when you're still in the middle of pull setup, but they generate no runic power. I thought the numerical advantages of Soul Reaper in priority target situations or single target situations would overshadow its misplay potential even in lower key levels, but that did not appear to be the case. From what I have seen this season, there are two mistakes I see more than others in this tree. One, sometimes people take Permafrost over Cold Thirst. Permafrost is not a good Mythic Plus talent in the War Within for much the same reason it was not a good Mythic Plus talent in Dragonflight, at least for Blood. The trickle healing is completely insignificant in any situation that actually has any chance of killing you. Meanwhile, the kick cooldown reduction and runic power generation from Cold Thirst is going to get you more value in practically every dungeon. Kicks are a lot more important now that stops have been nerfed, and more runic power is never a bad thing, even if this effect only works in a proportion of the pulls in a dungeon. Two, sometimes people don't take runic protection, even though this is less common now, and this provides around 3% damage reduction for physical damage all the time. It isn't exciting, but it is still one of the strongest talent points in the tree for Blood in Mythic Plus, and there is no reason not to take it. For the next few slides, we are going to focus on Deathbringer, which was the original best hero class and has the largest amount of data available for it. While it did receive some changes to its talents in patch 11.0.5, most of its talents remained one-sided in ways someone familiar with Blood Death Knight would expect, where you always want to take rune-carved plates, Death's Messenger, and Dark Talons. This was all predicted ahead of time, and the new data only supports these initial predictions. That said, the one exception to this was the Grim Reaper and Reaper of Souls choice node. Originally, I recommended Reaper of Souls for all players, but similar to Soul Reaper itself, there appears to be a skill gap in outcomes with this talent, and Reaper of Souls is only the best option if the player has enough rotational proficiency with the specialization. Otherwise, Grim Reaper can be more effective in the short term for that player. For the Blood talent tree as Deathbringer, the main changes moving into the War Within from Dragonflight is that Bloodshot was in a much weaker state with Deathbringer, given that the Deathstrike nerfs reducing Blood Shield uptime, as well as both Deathstrike and physical damage sources being a smaller portion of Deathbringer's overall damage profile. So Bloodshot really didn't look like a competitive consideration given the damage that we had from Dragonflight. Also, the trade-offs with the final talent points in the center of the talent tree in the War Within are a lot different than what they were in Dragonflight. In Dragonflight, you would mostly be deciding whether you wanted to put your last mid-tier talent point in Rune Tap or in Heartbreaker, with the pre-nerf Deathstrike. Hemostasis was not competitive at the time, and you would always want to take Ironheart. That being said, the Deathstrike changes made it hard to know with certainty how valuable Heartbreaker and Consumption would be defensively moving into the War Within. Ironheart was no longer guaranteed to be better than its competing talents in all cases. The Deathstrike changes potentially open the door for hemostasis healing to be more important than before as well. Rune Tap would potentially be worth more than before if we ended up taking some of these resource generating talents like consumption, but otherwise most seasons in Dragonflight showed that you needed to have a certain amount of proficiency with the Blood Death Knight rotation for Rune Tap to be good, or you needed to be in high enough key level, similar to what we were seeing with Soul Reaper earlier in this presentation. And finally, Bloodied Blade's benefits had some uncertainty associated with them, since the talent was and still is very buggy, and the benefits are tied to how often enemies would be attacking the player, which isn't the most consistent thing to predict in a dungeon setting. With some more recent information from logs, we finally got enough supporting information indicating that hemostasis generally underperforms enough relative to these other talents to remove it from being a flex talent option at all. This mechanically makes sense given the reduced damage Deathstrike does for Deathbringer, as well as Blood Boil casts being relatively infrequent for the hero class due to how much extra resource generation it has built in compared to Dragonflight Blood Death Knight. So this was not a surprise at all. There was a chance Rune Tap would perform well enough to be upgraded to an always recommend talent based on data that we had from Season 1 of Dragonflight, where players had near infinite runes due to a tier set bonus. Since consumption would really put us in a similar situation to that, really. But regardless of other talent selections, it still seems like player skill is a factor, like it was for all other seasons of Dragonflight after the first, and really similar to Soul Reaper. We have indications that it is the best performing flex talent among players pushing into and past plus 12 keys, but not a good talent on average for the players at key levels below that. So it remains a flex talent in the guide since it still requires a certain level of gameplay execution to be worth taking. The final interesting point is that log data indicated that while Consumption and Heartbreaker are both good talents to take on their own, that taking them both might be a bad idea. Mechanically, you only need one of these talents for pretty much all of your rotational downtime to go away. So when you take the second of these resource generating talents, you are really just replacing casts of one ability for another, which is worth a lot less than gaining additional casts of abilities in place of what otherwise would be rotational downtime. For Deathbringer, it is ambiguous as to whether Consumption or Heartbreaker is the better performing talent to take alone, while for Sandlane, Heartbreaker appears to be superior given the increased value of runic power for Sandlane. That being said, a lot of people are currently taking both Consumption and Heartbreaker in actual player representation for both hero classes, so either this is an uncommon situation where players got it wrong, or it is a consistent statistical error. I'm actually more inclined to believe that taking both of those resource generating talents is a mistake for the previously listed mechanical reasons, and that makes sense. But I'm more than happy to be proven wrong if further data ever starts pointing away from that. Finally, there are some indications that Bloodied Blade might be undervalued as a talent right now. If you audit logs, you will find that Bloodied Blade increases overall damage output in logs by around 5% for Deathbringer, depending on the dungeon, while also providing some relatively smaller survivability benefits. Now, this 5% number is obviously biased towards AoE damage to some extent, but it is still a non-trivial amount of damage given the fact that it is still bugged and only costs a single talent point that is not competing with any of the capstone talents. If you don't mind the detour, I want to quickly explain how Bloodied Blade is bugged. Bloodied Blade has three effects: a stacking strength buff, a double damage hard strike proc, and a final 10% strength buff that you receive after you trigger a hard strike proc. When the expansion first released, all three of these were bugged. Both strength buffs only affected base strength, which is the amount of strength you have when you are not wearing any items, and is noticeably lower than your strength total including items, while the Heart Strike proc does not work properly when the player is primed to use Vampiric Strike on Sand Lane. Instead of the normal 200% damage Heart Strike that costs no runes and generates no resources, when this procs a Vampiric Strike, it just does normal damage, it costs a rune, and it generates runic power. If the player does not have any runes available at the time, the Vampiric Strike will just fail to proc altogether. As of this video posting, only one of these bugs has been fixed, which is the bug for the stacking strength buff. The other two still remain. Even so, it still seems to be a respectable talent in Mythic Plus right now. With Deathbringer talent considerations out of the way, let us talk about Sand Lane, which received much more significant changes since the start of the expansion. While it shouldn't surprise anyone that Pact of the Sand Lane is the best performing bottom choice node option by all indications, we do have some log-based data that indicates that the best options uh, for the top utility choice nodes are Newly Turned and Bloody Fortitude. The confidence behind these indications isn't too overwhelming, but it is the best indication that we have to go off of at the moment for which options are best for these top choice nodes. As for the Blood Talent tree, Sandlane does bring some new dynamics to the table, especially after the several buffs it received up through 11.0.5. So the original talent tree recommendations are no longer valid, and what you're looking at is the current recommendation. First, the fact that Vampiric Strike is still affected by Improved Hard Strike means that Improved Hard Strike is actually a reasonable talent to take in Mythic Plus for Sandlane specifically, which is not true for Deathbringer and was not true in all of Dragonflight. Two, Death Strike actually does a significant amount of damage on Sandlane due to hero class multipliers, which means that Bloodshot is a consideration for Sandlane, despite not being one for Deathbringer. So this is more similar to a Dragonflight Season 1 and Season 3 situation. So it can be potentially good in particularly easy to survive dungeons when a lot of emphasis is placed on killing a specific dungeon boss over anything else, particularly if that boss includes hard damage checks. It also means that the direct benefit of hemostasis is actually reasonable in a few situations, which, in combination with the fact that Sandlane uses Blood Boil more, makes hemostasis a competitive talent. Given the combination of improved hard strike and hemostasis being stronger for Sandlane, and without the double Blood Plague damage talent that Deathbringer has, there is little reason to path into rapid decomposition at the moment for Sandlane, and instead you can path along the left side. Also, due to the Vampiric Strike proc chance outside of Dancing Rune Weapon being based on Death Strike cast rate, Heartbreaker is strong enough to recommend always taking that talent. While I still have it listed as a flex talent, log data does indicate that Consumption and Heartbreaker has anti-synergy for Sandlane, just like it does for Deathbringer, which does potentially call into question whether or not we should be taking Consumption on Sandlane and Mythic Plus at all, given that Heartbreaker is already a locked-in talent. I'm keeping Consumption as a flex talent option for now regardless, since I want more data before pushing against the talent that a lot of people are taking by default, but I'm keeping an eye on it, and the existing data is at least enough for me to stop using the talent personally. And despite the extra bugs, Bloodied Blade still shows as being potentially undervalued for Sandlane. This is a bit different than how Sandlane wanted to talent earlier in the season due to how the balance changes affected how its core mechanics worked. For example, older versions of Sandlane would always want to take both Consumption and Heartbreaker because it used to be a lot more difficult to maintain the Blood Queen stacking buff, and any talent that helped improve those chances just increased its value substantially. Also, the line of talents leading up to rapid decomposition were originally a lot more competitive to take. Now, let us move on to itemization, and before talking about more specific points, it is good to remind people of the stat line situation for both hero classes. While nothing has changed with this secondary stat recommendation this season, the main difference in Mythic Plus stat priority with Deathbringer compared to Blood Death Knight back in Dragonflight is Haste losing a lot of value as a secondary stat. Not only did its defensive value get gutted by the Death Strike nerfs, but pretty much all additional damage that the Deathbringer hero class adds is from sources of damage that don't scale with Haste at all, such as Reaper's Mark, Exterminate, and Blood Plague. Critical Strike's defensive value remains significantly worse than that of Versatility and Mastery, even without haste scaling on Death Strike, so nothing else changes from the traditional secondary stat priority. Sandlane, however, has a much more traditional looking secondary stat priority, even if it's for different reasons than before. While haste is still a really bad defensive stat for Sandlane, it has a very high damage contribution compared to all other secondary stats on Sandlane, which does a lot to offset the survivability disadvantage when looking at overall value. Not only does Sandlane rely more on naturally haste scaling sources of damage for its overall damage, but damage sources like Blood Beasts and Infliction of Sorrow have greater than normal haste scaling in their effects. So not only does the base proc rate of Blood Beast scale directly with haste, but because the ability is only triggered off of Vampiric Strike, because we can't always Vampiric Strike every 3.5 seconds, and because more haste increases how often we can Vampiric Strike. A 10% haste increase will increase your effective proc rate on blood beasts by more than 10%. On top of this, some portion of our shadow damage is inherently haste scaling, namely Vampiric Strike, so haste will also make each of these blood beasts do more damage than they normally would. Infliction of Sorrow is also responsible for some of the bonus haste damage scaling going on at Sand Lane, because not only do you gain more small Infliction of Sorrow procs with more haste from an increased number of Vampiric Strikes, but because of the extension effect, your average Blood Plague duration will be higher with more haste, making all Infliction of Sorrow procs do more damage on average, even the last one. That does a lot more damage. Versatility does see some extra benefits as well for Sand Lane, because for whatever reason, Blood Beast damage double dips on your versatility multiplier, though this is not as large of a benefit as what haste brings to the table. Trinkets for both hero classes haven't really seen that many changes from the start of the expansion, but there are a few things to note. First, right after the season began, Blizzard fixed the tuning on Algari Alchemist Stone. Alchemist Stone is a pretty standard versatility secondary stat stick that has been relatively unchanged for the last few expansions. That said, the reason you are seeing this used a lot this season, while basically not being used at all before, is because the power of trinkets this season is perhaps the lowest it has ever been since the first season of Battle for Azeroth. And since versatility is the best Mythic Plus stat for Blood Death Knights right now, a vanilla versatility secondary stat stick is a lot more competitive than most other trinket offerings at the moment. Sure, Mercurial Egg is technically best in slot for just about everyone, if you can keep its stacks managed in the correct ranges, but there's a very real question of if a player can successfully keep it in a good place in Mythic Plus, effectively enough for it to be a better option than other trinkets, and if the extra brain power you are devoting to this trinket is worth whatever marginal stat advantage it is able to provide. As such, Alchemist Stone is just more practical to use, and the bonus to healing potions isn't a bad bonus perk at all. Beyond that, Val Behemoth's Chelicera remains a very solid option once you consider its ability to increase player max life on top of its normal single target damage benefits. On paper, Chelicera started off in a situation where you really didn't need much of a maximum health benefit for it to be competitive for a best-in-slot trinket in Mythic Plus for Blood Death Knights, and after checking how much of these benefits players were able to actually get in real logged dungeons, it ended up being a more than high enough value to cement it in a best-in-slot position for players willing to use it. There are other trinket options beyond this point. If your options are more limited, the one other thing I wanted to specifically note is to be careful when you are looking at Simcraft readouts of Sack Brood, no matter what class or spec you are playing. Now, we've done some deep dives on this and looked at several logs, at least for Blood Death Knights, and Sackbrood effectively provides around 10% less strength than what you would get in a 5-minute sim, which is why Sackbrood shows up on the bottom part of this listing for both hero classes, where for Sand Lane it would otherwise be one of the best trinkets. I can explain this in more detail in the comments if someone wants me to, but the short explanation is that Sackbrood is a ramping buff effect that requires 1 minute of near continuous attacks to reach its full effectiveness, and because we are not continuously attacking things over the course of a dungeon, the trinket often is not fully ramped, so it loses some of its potential benefits. Embellishments were another area that wasn't 100% nailed down when the season began. It was very easy to narrow things down to two options, Symbiosis and Dusk Threads, but there were some complications beyond that point, which led me to provide the above recommendation of using Dusk Threads unless the player had a crafted weapon. First of all, it can't be understated that, at least on the scale of the power of embellishments, are bringing to the table, having 3 more item levels on a two-handed weapon instead of a losing those item levels on a minor armor slot is a large advantage for Dusk Threads. At the same time, it is a little irresponsible to just assume everyone has a 693 item level weapon with good stats available, especially at the start of the season. That said, the main trickiness is that we did not have a good method of predicting effective uptimes on either of these effects going into the War Within. For Dusk Threads, the closest parallel we had was Blue Silken Lining from Dragonflight, which had a similar effect with a 90% health trigger instead of an 80% health trigger. However, there was another big difference in how these effects functioned. With Dusk Threads, the game checks your character's health around every 5 seconds when determining whether or not you should gain the buff or lose the buff. So, as long as you were fast enough, you could Death Strike at low health while still under this versatility effect. However, Blue Silken Lining had a much more aggressive 1 second frequency checked specifically when checking to see if the buff effect should be removed. So, yes, we managed to find logs of Blood Death Knights using Blue Silken Lining and Mythic Plus from Dragonflight, but for mechanical reasons, we knew uptimes would be significantly higher with Dusk Threads in the War Within than what we were seeing with Blue Silken Lining. Meanwhile, the closest thing we had to a symbiosis effect before the War Within was from a trinket called Old Warrior's Soul in Shadowlands, which also wasn't a perfect match, but it was close enough to provide a reference point. The effective uptimes from these historical effects ultimately made it look like Dusk Threads would outperform Symbiosis in best in slot gear, though we needed to verify that Dusk Threads had at least a 60% uptime after the season started. Uptimes actually ended up being in the ballpark of 75 to 80% when we looked at actual key data, which was more than enough to support this recommendation. So let's talk about 11.0.7, which is really just talking about Circe's Circlet. This is a 3-socket ring that has 4 gem options for each slot. Each color has a direct damage option, a secondary stat option, a direct healing option, and a miscellaneous option. The effects of each socket scale with ring item level, and the ring's item level scales up to 658 from 639 after 6 weeks. With current tuning, the secondary stat effects are relatively strong for most specs and in most situations. Some of the damage effects look reasonable in raid situations on a few specializations. The healing effects are all relatively weak from a tank perspective, and the miscellaneous effects are competitive on the right specs and in the right situations. As a starting point, it is easy to talk about this ring assuming all of the secondary stat effects are taken, which I am putting up on the screen here, though the numbers listed are lower than what you will see in game. If you combine all of these effects, you will end up with a ring that mostly has a combination of your highest secondary stat and mastery, with a total secondary stat value that gets larger based on how much total mastery you have. If mastery is your highest stat, you end up with a ring that has a ton of mastery on it. So, for both hero class variants of Blood Death Knight in Mythic Plus that have reasonably optimized secondary stats, this combination creates a versatility and mastery ring with a small amount of haste and crit on it, which, in combination with a 19 item level disadvantage, is good enough to make this a best in slot ring just by using this secondary stat gem combination. That being said, there are ways for us to get even more value out of this ring in Mythic Plus. First, we have a miscellaneous stamina gem option that can be used instead of the mastery gem option. Even if we ignore the damage return effect, the amount of stamina being offered here is competitive with the amount of stats being provided by the mastery gem effect, assuming the player has a relatively normal stat line that is not overloaded on mastery. So, taking any damage return into consideration, the stamina gem looks like it might be better or be the better option in Mythic Plus for Blood Death Knights. Second, we have the legendary Skipper's Citrine, which procs a random gem effect at 150% effectiveness. This one is complicated, but I'm going to try and quickly explain why this looks to have better performance than the highest secondary stat gem effect, which is, in fact, one of the better gem effects itself. So, to start, this gem is capable of proccing any of the other 11 gem effects, including the passive gems, which proc as a 15-second buff. Due to the proc rate of this effect, you end up with more than their share of uptime, even before the 150% multiplier. So when you include this multiplier, the passive effects together are all bringing up the average above what the highest secondary stat gem provides. The damage gem procs are a lot more competitive with the 150% multiplier, and they end up being mostly neutral relative to what the highest secondary stat gem provides. The healing procs are worse than the damage procs and are the main thing dragging down the value of the average proc. for this gem. Finally, we have a single gem proc effect called Roaring War Queens, which procs the yellow gem effects from everyone else in our group. If you use this gem straight up, it has a penalty on its proc rate relative to other gem effects. But when it's coming from the random proc gem itself, it has no such proc rate penalty. As such, the random procs of this gem alone raise the average proc value of the random proc gem by a very significant amount. And altogether, the average random proc value appears to be higher than the value of the highest secondary stat gem. So, when it comes to Mythic Plus, these are the only gems we are really paying attention to as Blood Death Knights. I understand I still haven't talked about how the rotation has evolved moving into the War Within, other than some small notes on Soul Reaper, but this video is starting to get longer than I'd like it to be, so for now I'm just going to need to point people to look at the written advanced guide in the video description below if you want to see the full rotation breakdown and all related discussion. You could also leave a comment on the video or personally message me on Discord about any questions relating to that if you want. I wouldn't be doing the theory crafting for this specialization if I didn't mind answering questions about it, so don't worry about being too imposing or anything like that. So, what are my personal thoughts? While I am not a big fan of the clunkier aspects of Sandlane, I do think it is interesting that they managed to get both hero classes to a relatively balanced spot for Blood and Mythic Plus at least, though I dislike that it is hard to effectively use both hero classes at the same time due to large differences in their stat priorities. At least for now, the Deathstrike nerfs don't appear to have fundamentally changed much with how Blood is optimized or played, though there still is some potential we see some weirdness with mastery scaling later in the expansion when we have access to more secondary stats. That being said, this World War Haste basically has no defensive value still seems weird to me, personally. I do like the new talent trees better than the old ones, though it should probably be mentioned that Blizzard explicitly wanted it to be easier to take Gorfien's Grasp in Mythic Plus, which really didn't happen at all. Honestly, unless the ability becomes baseline, it will never be too successful at competing against any meaningfully strong talent, especially when we have Abomination Limb and 2 charges of Death Grip in every talent build already. And maybe one of these days they will finish bug fixing Bloodied Blade, but who knows. As for the new ring, I'm personally not a huge fan of using an item with a bunch of random procs instead of just making my base character stronger, but it isn't quite as bad as Onyx Annulet was, at least at face value. And while I don't mind the more complicated rotation myself, the amount of keybinds Blood uses right now can be a little overwhelming for some people, even though it is true that you can opt out of several options with build choices to reduce your keybinds. In any case, let me know what your thoughts are about Blood Death Knights this season, and if there's anything in particular you would like to see changed with Blood, or anything you think is especially problematic for Blood as it stands right now. As always, feel free to stop by the Blood DK Analysis Discord server if you want to talk about Blood Death Knight theory crafting, general Mythic Plus questions, or if you would like a Mythic Plus log review. The channel Discord information, as well as my personal Discord contact information, can be found in the video description below. And if you want to make it easier for other people to find this content, feel free to upvote the video and subscribe to the channel. In the meantime, good luck and have fun.